Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute's Next Round podcast. I'm Rowena Ichon, COO, and with me, as always, is Tim Anaya, Vice President of Marketing and Communications. So, Tim, the budget saga continues, and you've been following it. So where are we at now?
Well, it's Monday as we tape this podcast, and there is no white smoke yet. The legislature, or the legislative Democrats did pass their version of the budget late last week. And really that was more of an exercise of being able to continue receiving their paychecks, because that's one of the requirements. You have to pass a budget by June 15th or else legislators do not receive their paycheck. So they did that. They checked the box on that. You know, this is really the smoke-filled room phase of the budget. Democrats are negotiating with Governor Newsom to try to get a final agreement on a budget before June 30th. That's the real deadline here. So the governor has to sign the budget by June 30th, or else we start the fiscal year being unable to pay the state's bills. I don't think anyone is suggesting that we will enter the fiscal year without a budget in place, but these are critical days for the budget because we have the 72-hour in print rule. Basically, they have to reach a budget deal probably by the end of the week, first part of next week at the latest, because they have to have the language drafted and the budget in place in print for 72 hours before they can vote on it. One of the issues that has been a key hang-up has been transit funding. As we discussed a little bit last week, funding for transit agencies plummeted during the pandemic and even before, as ridership dropped sharply, that people didn't feel safe taking transit. They're not very clean. The options aren't very convenient to motorists to get them out of their cars. And then also, we had the pandemic. People are now working from home in much bigger numbers than before the pandemic. Transit agencies want a $2 billion bailout, and legislative Democrats are pushing for a bailout, and the governor has been resisting it, citing the challenging fiscal conditions that we face. So that's still a big issue that they're ironing out. And that's why today's podcast is so timely, because we have Marc Joffe, who is one of the top state transportation analysts on the free market side. And he's in conversation with our Stephen Greenhut, and they kind of talk through all of these issues about transportation funding, about a transportation bailout, and certainly the future of transportation. And they go through all the issues, including some of the key questions that we asked in our just released Free City Center booklet on transportation. How can we change transportation so that it's less focused on what government planners want to do and more focused around what consumers are looking for?
So, Tim, I got to ask you, what are the Republicans doing these days? Are they just cut out? And is this just the consequence of one party rule?
Well, they're there, and they certainly are raising objections during the debates, and they certainly are publicly raising their criticism of the legislative Democrat spending plan. But that's what happens with a majority vote budget, that they don't need their votes and they don't need to be a part of the process. So unless their votes are needed, that's just what happens with our current majority vote budget process. And, even if it was kind of the old way, Democrats have a supermajority in both houses of the legislature, so they wouldn't be able to stop the budget anyway. So, yeah, they're kind of there. They're along for the ride. They voice their objections. They can cast their no votes, but they really don't matter to the process.
Well, folks, that's a consequence again of one party rule. There you have it. So I want to make this quick announcement about Heather McDonald. She's going to be our next speaker at our luncheon in Orange County. That Heather McDonald's a New York Times bestselling author and Thomas W. Smith Fellow of the Manhattan Institute. And she's got a terrific new book out. It's called When Race Trumps Merit. So the luncheon is on Thursday, July 20th at the Pacific Club in Newport Beach. We'll also have a book signing after the lunch, so we hope to see all of you there.
And for those of you who can't make it in person and want to enjoy a great online event, July 26th, we're going to be hosting a webinar with New York Times bestselling author Carol Roth, who you may remember we had a great webinar with a couple of years ago in a conversation with our Dr. Wayne Weingarten. And this year, Wayne and Carol are going to be talking about her latest book that's called You Will Own Nothing. And it's kind of in-depth dive into ESG and all of this kind of woke investing that, have been key issues and issues that PRI has been working on. So it's going to be at 11 a.m. Pacific time on July 26th, and it's free for all. So make sure you go to pacificresearch.org to register for both events.
So thanks everyone for listening. And here's Marc Joffe.
Hi, this is Stephen Greenhut, Director of the Free Cities Center of the Pacific Research Institute. I'm here with Marc Joffe, Policy Analyst with the Cato Institute. We're at the BART station in Walnut Creek in the East Bay, and we're going to be talking about the state transportation issues and my upcoming book, Putting Customers First. So I've got a few questions for Marc, who's an expert in transportation policy. And I want to talk about falling ridership. Before COVID, ridership was falling. And then during COVID, it just fell through the floor. And then it's come back, but not that much.
Right.
So a lot of the policy planners seem to just blame the pandemic. But there's more going on than that, right? What are your thoughts on ridership numbers over time?
Well, yes, BART peaked in the mid 2010s, around 2014, 2015, and then it started dropping several years before the pandemic, and then really cratered during the pandemic. And now it's only recovered to around 40% of what it was in 2019. And there's just a lot of issues with people not wanting to go back onto BART, basically cleanliness, safety, just general concern about who you might meet on BART and what kinds of problems you might have during your trip.
The crime issue, there was a study I saw that just showed, and there are quite a few news reports about crime issues are just kind of out of hand, and that women riders, and not just in BART, on the LA transit system, that women riders have said they don't feel safe.
Yes.
And is it an actual problem? Do the numbers justify that? And what should the agencies do about it?
I think a lot of that goes unreported, although I was at a hearing in Sacramento a few weeks ago where someone from the bus drivers union complained about a lot of harassment from passengers to the driver, and also harassment just between passengers. But I think a lot of this is really under the radar screen. So we don't really know, how often this is occurring.
Yeah, I was taking a RT in Sacramento, and I think it was the last time I took it. And some of the things going on there, I mean, they didn't rise to crime, but they're things I can't unsee, and it certainly makes people feel uncomfortable, right? And
Definitely.
and what kind of policies should transit agencies embrace? I mean, it's obvious that you can arrest people who are committing crimes,
Yes.
but how do they provide a more friendly, comfortable atmosphere for riders?
Well, I think that BART already has a code of conduct, but I think that's got to be stricter. There's going to be more things that are prescribed. For example, sitting like this, with your occupying 2 or 3 seats, laying down on the seats. Those are the kinds of things that are sort of a gateway kind of behavior to maybe doing more antisocial things. But they already prescribe, drug use, eating on the train. Now it's just a matter of enforcing it.
Yeah. So the transit agencies, and from what I'm seeing, Governor Newsom and the transit agencies are pushing for huge infusions of cash to basically bail out the different transit agencies. Yes. And in my view, I don't think that's the solution, right? There's fundamental changes have to be made. And what are you seeing? What kind of fundamental changes can be made, to make these systems more user-friendly?
Well, I think that increasing safety and improving cleanliness is definitely part of the solution. Another thing is the reliability and the frequency of service. So in some day parts and in some parts of the BART system right now, you have to wait up to 30 minutes for a train. They're going to cut that down to 20. But still, if it's 20 minutes and you have to do a transfer, and then if potentially a train is canceled because an operator calls in sick, you could potentially be looking at adding 25, 30, 45 minutes to your expected time. And so it really gets to a situation where, can I drive? Can I take an Uber? It doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense if it's not going to be reliable and fast. So I think one thing that we really should be considering is increasing the frequency of service. Now, the problem with that is there's a shortage of operators, and operators are very expensive. So a lot of cities use automated trains, driverless trains. Vancouver is an example of a city that does that. That's, I think, something that systems like BART, Caltrain, LA Metro should be looking at.
And buses too, right? That would be even more important, I think, in a bus system to have a regular,
Yes.
Uh,
But buses are harder to automate. So the thing with a train is, especially here, because this is grade separated transit, there's really very little risk that something is going to come across the right of way. So the number of issues that an automated train management system has to handle is a lot less than, for example, a driverless vehicle. And we've seen there's been a lot of problems with driverless vehicles running into something, stopping for no reason. It's because of the sheer number of different scenarios they have to deal with. So for trains, it's just a great solution.
But for buses, I think I was getting more frequency, right?
Yes.
And I see, at least around where I live in the Sacramento area, I see a lot of mostly empty buses, these big buses.
Yes.
Aren't there better approaches? I mean, smaller buses or different privatized alternatives. I mean, what can we be doing, to make transit more appealing?
Yeah, well, vans are a great solution because they don't have that much capacity, and they obviously use less energy than double buses, right? So that's one thing, is to use vans, ride share like carpools, but like Uber pool, where you have maybe 3 or 4 people sharing an Uber. So one thing I've seen some cities do is subsidize that. So like the city of Dublin, for example, they had a program where anywhere in Dublin you could go for $5. And it was going to be like a shared Uber ride. So I think that type of solution is better, especially for the shorter distances.
Dublin, Ireland, right? Not Dublin, California.
Dublin, California.
Oh, Dublin,
California, yes.
Oh,
I don't
okay.
know. That's been a few years ago. I don't know what the status of that is, but that was something they were definitely looking into.
Part of the problem is, I think, the union contracts, right, that make routes a lot more inflexible and almost mandate driving these large buses, kind of an old model. Do you agree with that? Is there?
Can't say that I've looked into that a lot. I know that union contracts require things like brakes. And I remember I used to take the bus in San Francisco, and I was always wondering, why is that guy sitting there for like 15 minutes when I could be getting on the bus? And as you know, in San Francisco, it can get really cold. So it looked like they had some kind of deal where they could take a pretty long break, even if the bus was late.
Well, and also the union contracts also drive up the price of the drivers, right? I mean, almost.
Now, a lot of that has to do with the benefits as opposed to the base compensation. So BART, for example, pays over $30 million a year in other post-employment benefits, which is a fancy way of saying retiree health care. But we have Obamacare, or here in California we call it Covered California for people under 65, and we have Medicare for people over 65. So it's really hard for me to understand why retirees from BART or other public agencies need that additional coverage. They can just use the kind of coverage that everybody else uses.
Right, and there's almost a shadow workforce, right? There's so many people in retirement that those could, if it wasn't such an immense cost, you could actually have more drivers, right? Yeah. Which is the labor costs have to be the dominant cost, Definitely. More so than the vehicles, even. Definitely. I would guess.
Yes. Yeah, labor costs dominate.
Now, in LA during the pandemic, they tried the experiment of free ridership, and basically it turned into buses turned into moving homeless encampments, right? So what do you think of that whole concept? And I think it's wrongheaded, but
yeah. Laura Friedman is really into the idea of removing the link between fare box recovery.
Assemblywoman, right?
Assemblywoman Laura Friedman. This severing this link between fare box recovery and assessing the efficacy of a particular transit system. And I just think that's fundamentally the wrong answer. I think we should be looking at fare box recovery. Realistically, we can't assume 100% fare box recovery anymore. That was, pre-1960 when transit systems were private and a lot of them were able to function. That doesn't really happen anymore. But still, BART was over 50% fare box recovery before the pandemic. And I think we should be really looking for them to get there. Now, as you said, you get a lot of homeless people with free transit. you also get a lot of people coming onto the system to commit crimes. It's sort of the gateway crime that you're committing before you do the rest. And you can see back there that these turnstiles are not very resistant. It's pretty easy to jump over them. One thing that BART's doing that's very good is that they're going to be hardening all the fare gates between now and 2026. So that should reduce the number of people who are just trespassing onto the system and then doing a lot of other no good things once they get on.
Right, and when you don't charge people for things, they don't value it, right?
That's right.
And so,
and they don't value you as a customer.
Right.
There's the old Silicon Valley saying, when you get something free, you are the product.
Right.
And I think there's a lot of truth to that. You might have seen this controversy right now going on in Los Angeles over these new bus shelters that they've been putting in. And these bus shelters provide absolutely no shelter. It's like it's just this little metal thing that's attached to the bus stop sign. It doesn't provide you with any meaningful shade, and then at night it's going to have a tiny little light.
What's the point of it?
I think it's just a box checking exercise. Well, we provided shelter in all these these low income areas to women who need to be protected, but in fact, what is the real protection being provided? And I think, again, that's where, if they're not a customer, if they don't have skin in the game, paying, and they don't have any leverage over the people operating the system, so they can just say to whatever stakeholders they have, be they at the county level or board members of the system, well, we've done this.
Right. And that's one of the points I make in my book, is that we're not really customers, right? It's not a customer-driven system. One of the things I was reading was in Europe, it's more customer-driven, and in the U.S., there's more of a view of transit as almost a social welfare program. And in Europe, they're not hesitant to charge a more reasonable rate, but their goal seems to be to actually transport people in a comfortable and timely manner. Do you think that's true? And what? Well,
whenever I go to Europe, I have great experiences on mass transit, so I think that makes sense to me. Yeah. And remember, there are things about Europe compared to the rest of the United States besides the Northeast that are differentiators. And we are not as dense, so that means it's really harder to have a train station that's in the middle of everything where a lot of people can walk. So you really have a lot of issues with people having to drive to the station or take some other last mile option that don't exist in Europe. So because the city is more dense, it's a lot easier to have an efficient transit system than it is for us.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the transportation planners, they're like people who spent a summer in Europe in college, and they want to replicate it in places like, in Sacramento is a fairly spread out city. Yeah. It doesn't make sense. I saw one meme on Facebook that showed the density of rail in Europe, Central Europe, and then they compared it to the U.S., but where it's not dense at all. Right. Yeah, but we're talking, the pictures they showed were in like Nebraska and Colorado, and obviously that's silly. You have to design the system around the population and the way we live, but we can be doing something better, I think, right? And one of the things I think we're doing wrong, that California officials are doing, is just trying to use transit as social engineering rather than transportation engineering. So they're trying to lure us out of our cars, even if we live like I do in a place where it's totally unreasonable to take any sort of transit, rather than focusing on building transit where it makes sense and building roads where they make sense.
Right.
Yeah. So
and making roads as wide as they need to be to prevent a lot of congestion. So we have this strange idea about induced demand. So if you add another lane, that lane's automatically going to be full, and the traffic is going to be worse than it was before, and it just doesn't really make any sense.
Well, but let's talk about induced demand. I that drives me insane, and I deal with it a little bit in my book. So in what the transportation they're basically progressive transportation people say induced demand is it's pointless to build more freeway lanes because they're just going to fill up anyway.
Yes.
In my view, it's just called what is it when there's so much demand.
That's sort of latent
demand or whatever. There's so much demand that they expand the roads. Well, yeah, people are going to be using it because it's been so backed up. And then the way I look at it too is, let's say they opened a new BART line, and it filled up right away, they would be so thrilled. They wouldn't be saying, oh, it's induced demand, there's no point in building more transit. I think it's just an excuse to say, let's not bother building any more freeway lanes. And in one piece that I point to in Phoenix, they built so many highways that they really did dramatically reduce their congestion along that corridor.
Well, I mean, I do think their critique hangs together, to just give it the credit where it's due. I mean, the fundamental postulate is they don't want people driving because to them driving is a big source of greenhouse gas emissions. Even if you have an electric car, it's a big waste of resources to have an individual in a car driving alone. So the idea is to just get everybody on board these trains, and so that's like more socially efficient and good for the environment. I do think so I could see how they could celebrate a new BART extension being full, and then not a lot of demand, as opposed to a lot of people driving on a new lane that's being added.
Well, years ago, I remember when San Jose opened a new, it was a light rail.
VTA light rail.
Yeah, and there was actual serious talk about shutting down a freeway lane to kind of push people onto the light rail. I mean, that gets me to what I call the congestion lobby. Right, and I have nothing against transit. I'm not let's just all drive.
Right.
I think transit has its place, but freeways have their place too. But there's a congestion lobby. So they want more congestion so that we're made so miserable in our cars that we and so I'm not, you see that, right? That's
There's a term road diets.
Right, yeah, talk about road diets, please.
Well, I think the idea is, as you say, to just make people uncomfortable with driving so that they're going to be more open to alternatives like taking transit. Whereas I think the better solution is to make transit so attractive you would prefer not to drive.
Right, that's where making it a customer oriented, where I want to take it.
Yes.
Now, but tell the viewers might not know what a road diet is. So tell them it's the reduction of lanes. In fact, they used highway expansion money from a highway bond, right?
Yeah. That
was promised to reduce congestion, and they've actually taken lanes out of service and turned them into bike lanes and parking. Yeah. And the argument, I know Mayor Darrell Steinberg in Sacramento backed them by saying that it'll make the roads safer. Well, if you totally eliminate all, if you shut traffic to a halt, it'll be safer, but we won't get anywhere.
Right. So that's related to this concept of traffic calming, where you put speed bumps in and do other things like where the sidewalk bulbs out into the road so it gets more narrow. So the idea is that instead of going 35 miles an hour through a central area, you'll go 20 or 25 miles an hour. Again, making it more miserable for you to drive. On the other hand, I mean, there is a pro argument for it, which is that there are cases where people get run over because drivers are careless. And so maybe sometimes it does make sense to slow people down, but I think it's really only the safety argument that I think is acceptable, as opposed to just making it more complicated and more unpleasant to drive.
Well, and your point is a good one. I mean, there has been a spike in pedestrian deaths.
Yes.
So I think in places where there are a lot of pedestrians, in certain situations, you might do a traffic calming because but the overall goal should be to make transportation easier, right?
Yes.
So like, I haven't studied them, but these new traffic circles we see everywhere, they seem like a great idea to me, because I wish people would learn not to stop at the entrance of the, but once people learn how to use them, it keeps the traffic flowing.
Yes.
It reduces fatal accidents, maybe increases fender benders.
Yes.
But that seems like a way to use engineering to improve the flow of transportation. So I'm not against any changes in how we do things.
Right.
It's just that, and I like the whole idea of building more sidewalks, and there are places in suburban areas where it's very hard to be a pedestrian. So I'm all for all of that, but I'm not for just removing lanes to shut down traffic and turn it into gridlock so that we get off and take the light rail, which, by the way, doesn't operate at hours that suit me.
Right.
And
you have to wait a long time.
You have to wait a long time for it. If you miss, if you're running late in town, you miss the last train, and then you're stuck, right?
Yes.
Or in my case, I have to drive to a parking lot, pay a pretty hefty fee, wait a long time, get the rail line, then I have to get one from the rail line to where my appointment is, and then do the whole thing in reverse. So obviously, I'm just going to drive.
Right.
So,
well, one good thing about traffic circles, if I can dwell on that for a second,
Yeah.
is that it reduces idling.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing that we can do to reduce idling is use artificial intelligence with our traffic signals to optimize the amount of green when there's a lot of traffic on a particular road. So people are stopped less, idling less, and that's good for climate change, right? Because the less idling, the less useless greenhouse gas emissions your cars are making. But again, that's something that makes driving more attractive, because if you stop at a red light for 30 seconds instead of 3 minutes, driving becomes more pleasant. So
and they don't want
maybe
that.
they
Some
want
people
that.
don't want that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. I was looking at the Caltrans blueprint for the 2050 blueprint. It's basically their future transportation blueprint, and all it talks about, well, not everything, but the bulk of it is about climate change, about social equity issues. I'm not saying those things aren't important to a degree, but the thing isn't about transportation. Right. It's not about moving us around. It's about equity goals and share stakeholder involvement. And how do we get Caltrans to focus on transportation?
I think that's going to be a big political change. I would say that if you look at the worldwide greenhouse gas inventory, California accounts for 1% of all greenhouse gases worldwide, and then the transportation sector in California accounts for 40% of that. So if you were to completely ban cars and have everybody walk everywhere in California, we would still have 99.6% of the greenhouse gas emissions that we currently have. And then in a year or two, China will build a bunch of coal-driven plants, and any savings will have been wiped out. So a thing that I like to emphasize to people who are concerned with climate change: look, I don't want to deny climate change. I don't want to say we shouldn't be doing anything, but your ability as a California local government or state government policymaker to really move the dial on this is really, really low. Then there's another thing. So the Metropolitan Transit Commission, which sort of oversees all of the Bay Area transit, had put in a policy proposal during the pandemic that we would have 60% work from home by 2036. Transit operators didn't want that because that was going to reduce the amount of business they were going to get, so they convinced MTC to take that out. But the trip that you don't take is the ultimate savings in greenhouse gas emissions. If you stay in your home, or if you walk to the co-working space, or you walk to a cafe to do your work, that's a lot better for the environment than going anywhere by car or by transit. So I think that's something that we should be embracing, is how do we get more people to work from home or work in hybrid scenarios, as opposed to thinking about how we move them around.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Well, and that's goes back to the social engineering.
Yes.
Seems to be the drive, plus the politics of it, right? The influential unions or the transit agencies that are trying to gin up ridership.
They're moving away from a mega trend. So people, we're getting richer, and we want to buy more and more convenience. So in the pre-World War II era, a lot of people didn't have cars. Everyone was happy to get on a streetcar to get where they needed to go. Then in the post-war period, gasoline became cheaper, cars became cheaper, our incomes increased, and so people liked the convenience of having a car. So what we're trying to do now is say to them, no, you got to go back to the way it was before 1941, and people don't want to do that.
And after the entire development patterns, whether you like it or not, and I've read a lot of the critics of the post-war suburbanization, whatever you think of that, and I think it has its pluses and its minuses.
Yes.
But the whole, especially in California, all the development patterns seem to promote car-oriented living, and then now all of a sudden to try to adapt that back to a streetcar model is crazy. Now, unlike some of my conservative friends, I have been happy with the state's efforts to deregulate some land use. Right. Like we see all around here, we see transit-oriented development. Now, I'm not in favor of subsidies, but I think the idea of like SB 9 and 10, which make it easier to build duplexes and multifamily houses along transit corridors, I think that's a generally good trend.
Yes.
But I don't like the idea of transit agencies basing their whole model on the reordering of our entire development pattern. So I see this. I think it's fine to build new single-family neighborhoods out in exurbs, and it's good to build these higher density things where people will rely on transit. But I don't think that the transit plan ought to be reliant on the reordering of our land use patterns.
Right. Well, I live around here. I like mixed-use development.
Yeah.
It's very easy for me to walk from my apartment to all sorts of different amenities, coffee shops, stores, even big box stores, all within walking distance of my home. So here in Walnut Creek, downtown Walnut Creek, this is a 15-minute city. Yeah. You can get everywhere you need to go in 15 minutes. And I think that's fine for people who want that lifestyle. But to try to impose it on everybody, that's where we start getting into conflict, unnecessary conflict.
Yeah, and I remember, I think it was in the 90s, Governor Gray Davis, he cut the ribbon at a new freeway, Foothill Freeway. I think it was the spur of the 210 in San Bernardino County. And he said something to the effect of, the era of freeway building is over, right? and he wasn't right about much, but I think he was right that the state basically stopped building freeways at that point. And now we wonder, and the population stopped growing, but it has grown since the 90s.
Yes.
And we have all this crazy congestion. Isn't that tied directly to scuttling freeway expansion, right?
I think, yeah, definitely. Although, I mean, that one thing they're doing, which I think is good, is manage lanes. So the idea that you have, in fact, sometimes they do add a lane, but it'll be a toll lane, or it'll be a lane where you can have a carpool and not pay a toll, or if you're not in a carpool or not in a van, you got to pay a toll. I think that's fine. I think that's a way to pay for roads and pay for more lanes if we're willing to do that. Unfortunately, a lot of times they just take an existing lane and make it into a managed lane, which is not as good.
Right, that's right. Well, I know I used to live down in Orange County, and I still write for the Orange County Register, and the toll roads, yes, which were, I mean, they're quasi-private, that they and the governments have kind of gotten their hands in it, but it started out, the state refused to provide new freeway lanes, especially in South Orange County, which was growing quite rapidly. So they, I can't count exact, but they created a quasi-private agency, yes, and private bonds, and basically built what are probably the nicest freeways in the whole state.
Yeah.
And do you think there's more opportunity for those sorts of efforts, private type of efforts
if we were willing to do them? I mean, I just got back from speaking in Puerto Rico recently, and they are privatizing a whole bunch of roads there. I don't know that they have a declining population, so I'm not sure if they're going to do road construction. But the idea that a private company can do a good job of maintaining a road, and making money from the tolls and taking responsibility and tax money that or the need to spend tax money away from the state, I think is a very attractive alternative.
Well, I was down in Mexico and I haven't studied the road system, but they've built a whole lot of new freeways, and the tolls are extremely high. But I believe they might be privately.
Yeah, I would suspect so. Yeah.
Yeah, but
I saw that in Jamaica also. I think some Chinese company came in and built a road and charged like a really high toll.
Yeah, but if you're not paying all the tax bite,
exactly. And then it does take some level of traffic off of other routes. So if you're still on the traditional, government-owned road, there may be a few less vehicles on there, and you might get to where you need to go faster.
Yeah, we just ran an interesting piece about special economic zones and how different countries that are largely known by their corrupt governments or inefficient governments, woefully inefficient governments, have created areas that are essentially private cities, right?
Yes.
And the transportation possibilities are pretty exciting in something like that. Maybe California is becoming such a failed state that maybe someday in the future, I don't know if you've looked at those at all in terms of transportation.
Well, I haven't thought about it in transportation. I mean, I know that, for example, Honduras is really big on these special economic zones. It does seem to be a way of having more freedom to, operate businesses and employ people in different ways. But yeah, the transportation connection is an interesting one.
Yeah, and in a way, the OC toll roads, took a similar model,
Right.
right? So, okay, what is your vision? Detail your vision of what should the state do now, given reality? How do we improve our transportation system, transit roads, given
Right.
political realities?
So, right now we're staring at the Bay Area Transit agencies asking for $5 billion of additional state aid over the next 5 years. And then they're going to put a 1/2 cent sales tax on the 2026 ballot. Now some of that's going to go with federal funds to building more extensions. For example, in San Jose, they want to add 6 miles of BART to go through downtown San Jose and then to Santa Clara where the Levi Stadium is. Big problem with that is part of it actually parallels Caltrain, which is already underutilized. And then in this part of the Bay Area, they want to build a second tunnel under the San Francisco Bay, paralleling the existing tunnel, which is already not fully utilized. In fact, it's very underutilized now that we've had this pandemic-related ridership drop. So rather than waste all this money on these additional extensions, I think we really need to optimize what we already have through things like driverless trains to get frequency up, and then more sane policy towards building roads and lanes when we need them, treating everyone like they're a customer as opposed to being a product. I think those are some of the key benefits, and of course, encouraging people to work from home, and be able to walk when they can.
How do we convince transit officials to treat us like customers? Is there any idea? I mean, any?
I think it starts with the state saying no. I mean, right now, the state is $31 billion in deficit, and the transit lobby is asking for $5 billion. The easiest thing to say is, look, we've got other things that we need to spend that $31 billion on. We can't help you right now. And then you sort of force these agencies to think about how they can sharpen the pencil. I think facing Chapter 9 bankruptcy is a discipline that maybe we really need to be exploring at this point. That, I was researching an article recently, and I found that BART has an Office of Civil Rights.
Oh, right.
Do we really need that? Do we really need BART? I mean, it's certainly important, to have equality of opportunity and for people not to be treated in an unfair way based on their race. But is the purpose of a transit agency to solve all those problems, or can that be handled through private action or other types of government action? So what are all the things that BART are doing that are not really related to moving people efficiently from one place to another? And let's think about how we can get rid of those. And then let's think about where we're overusing labor, where we could be automating things, and then how do we pay attention to the quality of the experience that riders have. I think those will go a long way towards improving our problems.
Privatizing some aspects of the process, right? And your point goes to a point I often make, is that California makes the worst policy making when we have a good economic situation. Right. So when we had a $97 billion deficit, budget surplus,
yeah.
The money wasted it. We could have fixed so many problems.
Yeah.
Now that we have a budget deficit, maybe it'll force the state to make hard choices, like what Jerry Brown did back in he made some bad choices, but he also made
he got rid of redevelopment.
He made good choices,
thing,
right? And he sharpened the pencil.
Yeah.
And I remember at one press conference, a reporter asked him why he was cutting social programs, and he's like, because that's where the money is, So it makes you make hard choices.
When Stockton went bankrupt, they had to get rid of their retiree health benefits.
Right,
up until recently, I haven't looked in the last year or two, but they were considered by the state auditor to be one of the fiscally healthier cities in California, despite their chronic problems.
They did raise taxes twice, but I remember one city official referred to their health plan as a Lamborghini level health plan. It was. One last question: high-speed rail. Talk to me about what I think it's a boondoggle, and that money could be spent revamping the entire transit and transportation system. What do you think?
Well, I think it's really important for those of us on the free market, small government side to not have principled opposition to high-speed rail. If high-speed rail makes sense in a certain corridor, there's no reason to oppose it. In this particular case, they've made a lot of mistakes, and I think this system is now probably too far gone to repair. One of the major mistakes they made was not running it along Interstate 5, but instead creating a whole new right-of-way through Fresno, not quite down to Bakersfield, but to Wasco, and then through Hanford and so forth. So a lot of farmland had to be condemned. A lot of businesses in the downtown areas had to be shut down or relocated. And it's just taken a long time to acquire all the parcels. The last time I looked at the beginning of this year, even in that first 119 miles, they'd only acquired 96% of the parcels, meaning after 15 years of this project going on, 4% of the parcels in the very first operating segment had not even been acquired. Then we've got the next 52 miles, and really nothing's been done on that. So this thing, right now, it's estimated to cost $128 billion. That is definitely an underestimate because certain things were not costed, especially in the Los Angeles to Anaheim section. And so it's going to go up beyond that. And we don't have the money for it. The ridership is not going to be anywhere near what they're projecting. They finally have come down from 40 million annual riders once the system is fully operational to 31 million based on the fact that population is not performing the way we expect it. But even that was over optimistic. And if you look at Amtrak in the Northeast Corridor, their ridership peaked at something like 12 or 13 million. So why do we think with a lower population, people more spread out and no tradition of riding intercity rail, that we're going to be able to get to 31 million riders or anywhere near that? So it costs too much to build. It's going to lose a lot of money if it ever gets built. And so I don't think it's going to be finished.
Yeah, and then the trains have to share with Caltrain, which obliterates the promised travel time.
That was a concession that Governor Brown made. So when the first plan was that the entire 520 miles from San Francisco down to Anaheim would be completely on independent track. So when that ballooned, Brown said, okay, so the last 14 miles in Los Angeles and about 70 miles up here in the Bay Area, that's going to run on what's called the blended system. So now they can only get to 110 miles per hour instead of 220. And that 110 is really crazy because in Caltrain, there are about 36 grade crossings. Right now, the max speed is 79 miles per hour, and we have accidents. So now they're going to want to run trains at 110 miles per hour through a grade crossing. They're going to provide hardened gates, but you can see a lot of potential problems where there's going to be a train versus car or a train versus truck accident, and it's going to be really, really sad. So I think they should be honest and say, look, as part of the cost of this, we've got to grade separate all of Caltrain. And so far, they're not willing to do that because they can't deal with all the cost overruns that they've already had to admit.
Yeah, my big problem, and I agree with you, I don't have anything against one particular type of transportation. It all has to be cost effective and make sense. So, I mean, high-speed rail per se, I mean, if there were a cost-effective, useful high-speed rail, there's nothing philosophically against that. But I have problems with, Prop 1A was at 2008 when voters approved the $9.95 billion in initial bond funding. The plan that the High-Speed Rail Authority released basically violated every promise in Prop 1A, or most of them. And
they've yet to admit that they can't get you from San Francisco to Los Angeles in 2 hours and 40 minutes.
Yeah.
I actually asked them to send me their projections, and it's like 2 hours and 38 or 2 hours and 39 minutes. They've got it all planned, but it's based on going 110 miles per hour through railway crossings in places like Burlingame. It's not going to work.
Yeah, I just think if they were going to do it, they should have had a realistic plan and stuck to the plan. And although the courts didn't see it my way, if they totally redid the plan, Quentin Kopp, the former state senator and supervisor from San Francisco, known as the father of rail, actually came out and opposed the current rail system because it seemed to violate what he had proposed. And I think if you're going to promise voters something, you should follow your promises or scuttle the project.
Yeah, well, so we're 15 years out from that ballot measure passing. This is the 15th year. And the excuse that you get from a lot of the pro high-speed rail people is, well, if the opponents hadn't been blocking this all the time, it wouldn't have been a problem. Yes, there's been a couple of instances where opponents came up, but in some cases they weren't originally opponents. So the people who were suing about the land takings in the Central Valley, if you read their website, they said, we were originally for this. We just thought it was going to run along I-5 and it wasn't going to affect our livelihood. So they made enemies in the process. It wasn't just a bunch of conservatives and libertarians or just against high-speed rail stopping all of this. It's the way they've executed the project that's been so bad.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Okay, any last final thoughts you'd like we ought to point out broadly?
Well, we're here in Walnut Creek, which is a major stop on BART, and we have some interesting things to show. I don't know if you have a chance to show them, but we have the bad fare gates there. We have the new nice fare gate over there, and we have some really interesting transit-oriented development. I think the transit-oriented development has a big problem. So they have a lot of ground floor retail in the transit-oriented development, and none of it's been occupied yet. And it looks like the problem that we've got is the operating costs of businesses are now, retail businesses are so high with minimum wage, unemployment.
Well, Mark, thank you for taking the time. We sure appreciate it.
Thanks for coming to Walnut Creek.
Yeah, all right.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.